Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Peace be upon you all. As Mick said, I originally come from Iraq, and I stood here 20 years ago addressing honest people like yourselves to stop the war on Iraq. And I'm now very honored to stand in front of you. I consider you all as brothers and sisters and also comrades. It is so uplifting to see people from all faiths, color and race, young and old, gathered together here and united under the flag of justice and peace. Justice and peace for Palestine. Justice and peace for the Palestinians, from the river to the sea. We stand here against the slaughter of the innocent and their thousands by an apartheid regime. We stand just as we did 20 years ago against the invasion of Iraq in 2003. What happened to the Iraqis then mimics exactly what's happening to the Palestinians now. The punitive sanctions on the Iraqi people before the 2003 war, a medieval siege, as John Pilger, the writer, puts it. Almost everything that sustained modern states was blocked. From chlorine for making water, from making water supplies safe to drink, to school pencils, to common painkillers, even children vaccine was blocked because they said these vaccines could be used in weapons of mass destruction. They made sure, however, the flow of oil from Iraq wasn't going to stop. They came up with a scheme, the Oil for Food program, a bogus humanitarian gesture which entailed Iraq should continue to export its oil and the revenues to be administered by the US under the umbrella of the UN, ciphering what the Iraqis should get for their sustenance. Iraq was getting the equivalent of $100 per head per year. This was to pay for the whole country's infrastructure and essential services, such as power and water. The UN Assistant Secretary at the time described it as genocide. He resigned his post shortly afterwards. Brothers and sisters, the Israelis are doing the same just now. They decided to go soft by offering the people of Gaza a gesture of goodwill, a daily pause of 4 hours, giving the Gazans a breather before getting killed. At the height of the blockade on Iraq, there were 500,000 infants, excess deaths of those infants under the age of 5. Madeleine Albright, who was the US ambassador to the United Nations, then said, it's a price worth paying for. Millions took to the streets of London, Glasgow, Edinburgh, in France, in Germany, in Russia, in Italy, even in America itself, in the Middle East, in African countries, in the Far East, just like us now, brothers and sisters. Just like us now, people of all backgrounds, young and old, they all united shouting, not in our name. And we're shouting now, not in our name. Many politicians rebelled against the government. The country saw the birth of a solidarity group in a manner that was never seen before. And I felt so honored marching the streets of Glasgow, the streets of Edinburgh and London. Iraqis were comforted by the masses marching against the aggression. Despite all that, and under the false pretenses of Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction, the US and the UK went to war, invading Iraq in March 2003, but only after a horrendous campaign of bombing by both the US and the UK, which is exactly what the Israelis have been doing. The British and the Americans had total control of Western media, ciphering what to be broadcasted then. But other media channels like Al Jazeera were showing the true ugliness of that war. We saw the bombardment of civilian buildings, civilian casualties. We saw the aggression of the occupying forces in its true color and in its true ugly faces. To silence Al Jazeera, their headquarters in Basra and in Baghdad were shelled, killing one of their reporters. Exactly what's happening now. Unlawful weapons of mass destruction like cluster bombs, depleted uranium, and phosphorus bombs were heavily used on Iraqi cities. In April in 2003, and despite all odds, I managed to get to Iraq 3 days after the fall of Baghdad. I spent 6 days filming and taking pictures of smoldering buildings, wrecked houses, documenting the misery of a whole nation. I was given detailed accounts of events in hospitals. Doctors were operating with no electricity to save lives. They ran out of basic essentials, including clean drinking water. Dead people were hurriedly buried in street corners and in public gardens simply because it was difficult getting to the cemeteries then. Dead bodies were being pulled out of shelled, collapsed buildings. The once beautiful city of Baghdad was heavily raped of its beauty, casting a shroud of sadness and misery. The true colors of the invading forces suddenly emerged. The so-called liberators became occupiers. I visibly witnessed this in my second trip in the same year, a few months later. American soldiers started making their presence felt in urban areas and every government building, intimidating the ordinary citizens. Homes were raided and ransacked and content robbed during the night without prior warning, subjecting the occupants to horrific experiences with women and children screaming out of fear. Innocent civilians were shot at justifications that they were mistaken for being part of the resistance. The Americans were both nervous and trigger happy. And believe it or not, tanks were roaming the streets in civilian areas. There were a number of incidents when tanks drove over cars with people inside them when the traffic was coming to a standstill in a heavily congested areas, urban areas. Night curfews were imposed. The Iraqis were detained in makeshift prisons and were subjected to mental and physical torments. Many of you, of course, would remember the atrocities committed in the Abu Ghraib prison. Prisoners were subjected to ugly forms of torture, including physical and sexual abuse, electric shocks, sleep deprivations. Prisoners were made to lie naked on top of each other, forcing prisoners to stand in the sun in midsummer days with temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. Underfloor imprisonment in heated cells, limitation to a single meal per day, not to mention sexual assaults on both men and women. And I could go on and on. American soldiers were behaving like cowboys. Their childish behavior was very intimidating, pointing guns at people in a provocative manner, laughing off the shooting of people like playing video games. More than 1 million Iraqis died. Mass exodus of internal displacement of 2 million people. Civil wars and sectarian killing that is being felt till this very day. The genocide of Fallujah, small city in western Iraq, is evidence of their brutality. Not even animals escaped the phosphorus and cluster bombs. However, on the positive side, we're told, Iraq now has the largest embassy in the world. at 104 acres, the American embassy in Iraq is nearly as large as the Vatican City, with running cost of $6 billion. I wonder why. And now the country is governed by ruthless militia groups and corrupt politicians led by a degenerate bunch of clerics taking the country many decades backwards. People like Mick and myself and thousands of honest, decent men and women took to the streets then in massive demonstrations against the sanctions and the war afterwards. And will continue with this path against the occupation of Palestine to bring an end to this campaign of horror, the Holocaust of the 21st century. We cannot be complacent. No matter how long is this going to take, what's happening in Palestine is history repeating itself. And that's why we need to be here every week in solidarity with the people of Palestine and against the fascist, Zionists, and all who support them, such as Biden, Sunak, Keir Starmer, and the current Home Secretary, who hopefully will soon be the former Home Secretary. I thank you all. And as I said, I'm really honored to be here amongst decent and honest people like yourself. Free, free Palestine. Thank you.
You know,